Picture a world where morning never truly arrives, where the sun hangs as a dim, ghostly orb in a sky choked with ash, casting barely enough light to see by. Crops fail, temperatures plummet, and whispers of doom spread like wildfire. This wasn't the plot of a dystopian novel. It was the year 536, a time so harrowing that historians and scientists still refer to it as the worst year to be alive. The sky itself seemed to turn against humanity, plunging entire civilizations into a darkness that lingered for months, even years. But what caused this nightmare? And why does it still send shivers down our spines centuries later? The answer lies in a perfect storm of natural disasters, events so catastrophic they reshaped the course of history. A massive volcanic eruption, possibly from Iceland or Central America, spewed so much ash and sulfur into the atmosphere that it blotted out the sun. Temperatures dropped sharply, triggering famine, disease, and social collapse across the globe. From Constantinople to China, records from the time describe a world gripped by fear and desperation. Trees stopped growing, birds fell silent, and for the people living through it, it must have felt like the end of days. But here's the chilling part. The trauma of 536 didn't just fade into obscurity. It etched itself into the collective memory of humanity, influencing myths, religions, and even the course of empires. Some scholars believe it accelerated the fall of Rome. Others point to eerie parallels in folklore, like the Norse legend of Fimbulwinter, a prelude to the apocalypse. Today, we're piecing together clues from ice cores, ancient texts, and tree rings to unravel this ancient mystery. So buckle up, we're about to journey back to one of the most terrifying chapters in human history, a year when the sky itself became the stuff of nightmares. The horror of 536 wasn't just whispered in legends, it was meticulously recorded by those who lived through it. Take Procopius, a Byzantine historian who wrote of a sun that gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon during an eclipse. His words weren't poetic exaggeration. Across the Mediterranean, Senator Cassiodorus penned desperate letters, describing a sky so thick with haze that shadows vanished at noon. Farmers couldn't tell time by the sun's position. Crops withered under a perpetual twilight. These weren't isolated accounts. Similar descriptions emerged from Ireland to China, all echoing the same terrifying refrain: the sky had broken. Modern science confirms their terror. Ice cores drilled from Greenland and Antarctica reveal a staggering spike in sulfate particles around 536, the unmistakable fingerprint of a volcanic eruption so colossal it dwarfed even Krakatoa. Tree rings from that period show something even more chilling. Growth nearly stopped for over a decade. Temperatures likely plummeted by as much as 2.5 degrees Celsius globally, triggering a climate catastrophe. Summers turned to winters, snow fell in August, and with failing harvests came starvation, then desperation. The world hadn't just stumbled into a bad year, it had crossed a threshold into an era of suffering. But the real tragedy unfolded in the aftermath. Societies already strained by war and instability now faced an existential threat. In Constantinople, grain shipments faltered as fields lay barren. In Scandinavia, entire villages may have vanished under unrelenting cold. The stage was set for an even deadlier blow, the Justinian plague, which arrived just a few years later, fueled by weakened populations and disrupted trade routes. What began as a geological disaster spiraled into a human one, unraveling empires and reshaping civilizations. The sky didn't just darken in 536, it cast a shadow that lingered for generations. The proof of 536's devastation isn't just buried in ancient texts, it's literally frozen in time. Deep within the ice sheets of Greenland and Antarctica, scientists have uncovered layers of sulfuric acid dating back to that fateful year, like pages in Earth's own history book. These icy time capsules tell a story of unimaginable eruptions, with sulfur dioxide levels suggesting volcanic explosions 10 times more powerful than Mount Pinatubo's eruption in 1991. The sheer volume of ash and gas injected into the atmosphere would have circled the globe within weeks, creating a sun-blocking curtain that lingered for years. But the most haunting evidence comes from something far more ordinary: tree rings. Across Europe, Asia, and North America, trees from that era bear the same eerie signature: growth rings so narrow they're nearly invisible. Oaks in Ireland, pines in Scandinavia, even ancient bristlecone pines in California, all tell the same tale of stunted survival. Normally, trees add a thick new ring each growing season. But in 536 and the years that followed, many barely grew at all. It's as if the planet itself held its breath. What makes these natural archives so compelling is how they corroborate human accounts with cold, hard data. When Procopius wrote of a darkened sun, the ice cores confirmed it wasn't hyperbole. Sulfate concentrations spiked precisely when he described the skies turning eerie. And those starving populations, the tree rings, proved their crops weren't failing from neglect, but because the climate itself had turned against them. Together, these silent witnesses form an undeniable chain of evidence. Modern technology lets us read these archives with startling precision. Laser scans can detect individual volcanic particles trapped in ice layers, while isotopic analysis of tree rings reveals summer temperatures dropped by several degrees. Some trees even show signs of frost damage in what should have been their peak growing months. The data paints a picture so consistent, so globally synchronized, that it leaves no doubt 536 wasn't just a bad year. It was a geological event that rewrote the rules of life on Earth. Perhaps most chilling is how these natural records reveal the disaster's longevity. While human chroniclers focused on the immediate horror, the ice and trees tell us the suffering lasted far longer. Sulfate levels remained elevated for over a decade, and tree growth didn't recover fully until the 550s. This wasn't a single catastrophic year, but the start of a volcanic winter that reshaped an entire generation's destiny. The scars in those ice cores and tree rings aren't just scientific curiosities, they're echoes of a global trauma written into the very fabric of our planet. For decades, the volcanic culprit behind 536's nightmare skies remained one of history's greatest cold cases. Then, in the 21st century, a breakthrough emerged from an unlikely place, Lake Ilopango in El Salvador. Beneath its tranquil waters lay the remnants of a supervolcano that erupted around the same time, spewing enough ash to bury entire cities. Geological evidence suggests this wasn't just any eruption, it was a VI6 event, 100 times more powerful than Mount St. Helens. The explosion would have launched millions of tons of sulfur dioxide high into the stratosphere, where winds could carry it across hemispheres, but Ilopango might not have acted alone. Ice core records show not one but three distinct sulfate spikes between 534 and 540, hinting at a terrifying possibility. What if multiple volcanoes erupted in quick succession, each compounding the last devastation? Some researchers point to potential candidates in Iceland and North America, where volcanic layers from this period have been found. Like a cascading domino effect, each eruption could have piled more debris into the atmosphere, turning what might have been a severe climate event into a full-blown global catastrophe. The mechanics behind this disaster reveal why supervolcanoes are nature's ultimate game changers. Unlike typical eruptions that affect local regions, these giants inject their payload directly into the stratosphere, the atmospheric layer above weather systems. Here, sulfur gases transform into reflective sulfate aerosols, creating a planetary sunshade that can linger for years. Sunlight scatters, temperatures plummet, and weather patterns go haywire. Models suggest Ilopango's eruption alone could have cooled the northern hemisphere by up to 4 degrees Celsius. Now imagine that impact multiplied by multiple eruptions. This helps explain why 536's suffering lasted so long. Normally, volcanic particles rain out of the atmosphere within months, but when eruptions recharge the stratosphere's aerosol layer faster than it can dissipate, the cooling effect becomes self-sustaining. Crops fail year after year, ecosystems collapse, and human societies already living on the edge in many regions face compounding crises with no reprieve. The archaeological record shows abandoned villages across Europe during this period, their inhabitants likely victims of this extended environmental assault. What makes this volcanic whodunit so fascinating is how it reshapes our understanding of historical turning points. For centuries, the decline of Rome and the upheavals of the migration period were attributed to politics or pandemics. Now we see climate as the invisible hand behind the chaos. The ash from Ilopango and its possible accomplices didn't just dim the sun, it may have accelerated the fall of empires, redirected human migrations, and even influenced cultural memory for generations. When Norse skalds later sang of Fimbulwinter's endless cold, were they unknowingly preserving ancestral trauma from this very event? The volcanoes have been silent for 15 centuries, but their fingerprints on history remain indelible. The catastrophe of 536 didn't discriminate by geography or empire. It struck with terrifying equality across continents. In Constantinople, Byzantine scribes recorded midsummer snowfalls so bizarre they took them as divine omens. Wheat withered in Italian fields during what should have been peak growing seasons, while Persian astronomers noted the sun's dim glow resembled a lamp covered with sackcloth. Halfway across the world, China's Liang dynasty faced its own nightmare. Official records from the period describe yellow dust falling like rain, unseasonable frosts killing mulberry trees essential for silk production, and widespread famine that reduced desperate populations to eating bark. What's chilling is how these disparate accounts form a unified global narrative. Irish monastic chronicles speak of a failure of bread from 536 to 539, while Finnish oral traditions describe 3 years when the sun gave no heat. Even in Mesoamerica, where written records are scarce, archaeologists find clues in the soil. Sediment cores from Lake Chichancanab show severe drought conditions around this time, a finding that aligns with evidence of political upheaval among the Maya. Their once flourishing city of Teotihuacan shows signs of violent destruction in this same period, suggesting climate stress may have triggered societal collapse. This planetary synchronization reveals a fundamental truth about Earth's climate. It operates as one interconnected system. A volcanic eruption in Central America could starve farmers in Scandinavia. Ash drifting over China might alter monsoon patterns that sustained Indian civilizations. The jet stream, ocean currents, and atmospheric circulation don't respect human borders. They tie our fates together in ways ancient societies couldn't comprehend. When Procopius wrote of Byzantine ships struggling through unusually dense fog on the Black Sea, he was unknowingly documenting the same event that caused unseasonable hail in Korea and failed peach harvests in Japan. Modern climate models show how this domino effect likely unfolded. Sulfate aerosols from tropical volcanoes like Ilopango would have disrupted the intertropical convergence zone, the atmospheric engine that drives rainfall patterns across Africa and Asia. As monsoons weakened, crops failed from Ethiopia to Cambodia. Meanwhile, in northern latitudes, the volcanic haze amplified a phenomenon called Arctic amplification, where cooling snow cover reflects even more sunlight away, creating a vicious cycle of plummeting temperatures. The result, a planet where no civilization, no matter how advanced or isolated, could escape the consequences. Perhaps most sobering are the cultural echoes this disaster left behind. The Chinese phrase, 3 years without summer, appears in multiple 6th century texts, mirroring almost exactly the 3 years of death described in Norse sagas. In Mesoamerica, the Popol Vuh, the Maya creation epic, contains haunting passages about a time when the face of the sun was darkened. These parallels aren't coincidental. They're proof that 536 wasn't just a weather event. It was a shared human experience so traumatic it shaped collective memory across cultures separated by oceans and languages. What emerges from these scattered fragments is a portrait of resilience as much as ruin. From the rice terraces of Yunnan to the olive groves of Greece, societies adapted in astonishing ways. Byzantine engineers redesigned water systems to conserve scarce resources, while Chinese physicians developed new treatments for malnutrition-related diseases. The Maya shifted settlements toward cenotes, natural wells, to survive drought. These innovations hint at humanity's quiet defiance in the face of planetary catastrophe, a testament to our species' ability to endure even when the sky itself seems bent on our destruction. Yet they also serve as a warning. In our modern age of climate uncertainty, the lessons of 536 feel uncomfortably relevant, proof that when Earth systems falter, no corner of the globe remains untouched. Beneath that ashen sky, hunger became the great equalizer, reducing emperors and peasants alike to the same desperate struggle. Byzantine historian Procopius wrote of crowds in Constantinople gnawing on unnatural foods, his delicate phrasing likely masking horrors like boiled leather or clay. In Ireland, the annals of Ulster tell of people abandoning infants in the woods, unable to feed them. Chinese court records from the Liang dynasty describe villages where 9 out of 10 residents perished, their bodies piled in ditches too numerous to bury properly. This wasn't mere scarcity, it was the unraveling of civilization's most basic covenant that the earth would provide. The psychological toll was as devastating as the physical. When the Lombards migrated en masse into northern Italy around this time, their chronicles speak less of conquest than of sheer survival, entire clans fleeing lands that could no longer sustain them. In Persia, Zoroastrian priests interpreted the perpetual gloom as a sign of Angra Mainyu's triumph, the cosmic force of darkness. Their rituals grew increasingly frantic, with some texts hinting at human sacrifice to appease the angry skies. Even nature seemed to rebel. Welsh bardic traditions recall wolves descending from mountains to stalk weakened villages, while Scandinavian sagas tell of bears abandoning hibernation to roam snowless winters in search of food. Archaeology confirms these accounts in heartbreaking detail. Excavations across Europe reveal 6th century mass graves where victims show signs of advanced malnutrition, porotic hyperostosis. A spongy bone condition caused by severe anemia appears in over 60% of remains. At one site in Bavaria, skeletons of a woman and child were found curled together, their stomach cavities filled with indigestible weed seeds, a final, futile attempt to quell hunger. In China, paleobotanists analyzing latrine sediments from this period found traces of tree bark and toxic plants normally avoided, evidence of people risking poisoning over starvation. What made this famine historically unique was its duration. Most pre-industrial food crises lasted a single growing season, but ice core data shows the climate anomaly persisted for over a decade, creating a nightmarish cycle. The first year, people ate their seed grain. The second, they slaughtered plow animals. By the third, social bonds fractured entirely. Byzantine tax records show entire provinces declared empty by the 540s, while in Gaul, law codes from the Merovingian kings suddenly included harsh penalties for cannibalism, a crime previously so unthinkable it hadn't required legislation. The collapse of trade networks amplified the disaster. With roads unsafe and ships grounded by poor visibility, salt essential for food preservation became lethally scarce. Irish monks wrote of meat rotting on the hoof for lack of salt to cure it. In the Alps, communities that had relied on Roman-era salt routes turned to burning certain ferns for their minuscule mineral content. This breakdown had chilling secondary effects. Without salt to preserve medicines, diseases spread unchecked. Without reliable transportation, regional shortages became catastrophe. Grain might rot in Egyptian storehouses while Italians starved just across the Mediterranean. Yet amid the darkness, glimmers of human ingenuity emerged. In Cappadocia, archaeologists found 6th century grain silos modified with innovative ventilation systems to prevent mold in the damp cold. Chinese agricultural manuals from the period suddenly included instructions for frost-resistant millet varieties. Most remarkably, dendrochronology reveals that some Scandinavian communities survived by shifting entirely to fishing. Their trash middens from this era contain astonishing quantities of herringbones, suggesting they mastered open water techniques during years when farmland failed. These adaptations came at a cultural cost. The sudden prominence of fishing in Norse societies may explain why Viking Age mythology later featured so many sea monsters transformed into legend. Similarly, the Irish epic, The Destruction of Dodurga's Hostel, filled with imagery of cannibalism and societal collapse, likely preserves folk memories from this era. When the sky finally cleared, the world that emerged was irrevocably changed. The old gods had failed, the social order had shattered, and the survivors carried with them not just empty bellies, but a profound loss of trust in the natural world, a psychological scar that would shape the coming dark ages. Just when it seemed the world couldn't endure more suffering, nature unleashed its cruelest blow. As populations already weakened by years of famine huddled in cramped quarters for warmth, a new nightmare arrived on rat-infested grain ships, the Bubonic plague. This wasn't merely another disease outbreak. What historians now call the Plague of Justinian became the deadliest pandemic the ancient world had ever seen, claiming an estimated 25 million lives at its peak. But its connection to 536's climate catastrophe reveals a terrifying pattern of domino effects. The plague's timing was no coincidence. Scientists now understand how volcanic winters create perfect breeding grounds for pandemics. When crops failed across the Mediterranean, desperate populations crowded into cities where imperial grain stores offered slim rations. These packed, unsanitary conditions turned urban centers into tinderboxes for disease. Meanwhile, the unusual cold may have driven disease-carrying rodents indoors alongside humans, creating new transmission pathways. Byzantine physician Procopius described victims breaking out with black pustules about as large as a lentil, unaware he was documenting history's first recorded encounter with the bacterium Yersinia pestis. Genetic analysis of ancient plague victims shows something even more disturbing. The strain that emerged in 541 was exceptionally virulent, likely having mutated rapidly in the stressed animal populations of the time. Normally, plague circulates slowly among wild rodents, but the climate chaos of 536 likely disrupted these natural reservoirs, forcing the bacteria into new hosts and accelerating its evolution. By the time it reached Constantinople's crowded slums, it had become a killing machine capable of wiping out entire households within days. The pandemic's spread followed the shattered trade routes of a broken world. Ships that once carried grain now carried death, with plague ports springing up from Alexandria to Marseille. In Pelusium, Egypt, where the outbreak allegedly began, contemporary accounts describe so many corpses that pyramids of bodies were left unburied. The disease raced along Roman roads now patrolled by scavengers rather than soldiers, reaching as far as Ireland by the 550s. Irish monastic records tell of villages where the life of humans and animals alike perished, their words corroborated by mass graves uncovered in modern archaeology. What made this biological catastrophe unique was its interaction with pre-existing vulnerabilities. Malnourished immune systems offered little resistance. Traditional healers found their herb gardens frozen solid, leaving communities defenseless. Even the social fabric necessary for caregiving had unraveled. Procopius wrote of houses where the dead and dying lay piled together, abandoned by terrified neighbors. The plague didn't just kill individuals, it obliterated the very networks that might have mitigated its impact. The demographic consequences were staggering. Constantinople lost an estimated 40% of its population in just 4 months. Rural areas fared no better. Tax records from Antioch show 90% of some villages simply vanished from official rolls. This depopulation triggered secondary collapses. Fields went untilled, artisan skills disappeared, and literacy rates plummeted as educated elites died in droves. The Eastern Roman Empire, already reeling from climate disasters, found its tax base hollowed out just as it needed resources most. Some historians argue this double catastrophe, famine followed by plague, marked the true end of antiquity, pushing Europe irreversibly toward the Dark Ages. Yet the plague's legacy extends beyond body counts. It reshaped spirituality across continents. In Byzantium, the crisis fueled the rise of apocalyptic Christianity, with mosaics from the era increasingly featuring scenes of divine judgment. Simultaneously, in Zoroastrian Persia, fire temples recorded unusual numbers of conversions as people sought new explanations for their suffering. Even Buddhism's spread through China during this period may owe something to plague survivors seeking meaning in philosophies of impermanence. Modern epidemiologists see ominous parallels in this ancient tragedy. The same climate disruptions that amplified the Justinian plague, shifting animal habitats, stressed immune systems, disrupted food chains, are recurring today on a planetary scale. When researchers recently sequenced the 541 plague strain, they found its genetic fingerprints alarmingly similar to modern variants still circulating in rodent populations. It's a chilling reminder that the ghosts of 536 never truly left us, they merely retreated, waiting for the next convergence of ecological instability and human vulnerability. Perhaps the most haunting lesson lies in how these events intertwine. The volcanic eruptions didn't just cool the climate, they set in motion a cascade of biological and social disasters that compounded geometrically. A single degree of temperature drop might mean failed harvests. Failed harvests led to malnutrition. Malnutrition bred disease susceptibility. And when the plague arrived, it didn't just kill people, it erased knowledge, shattered institutions, and rewired civilizations. This is the true terror of 536's legacy. It shows how closely humanity's fate remains tethered to forces far beyond our control, and how quickly the threads of civilization can unravel when those forces collide. When the skies darkened in 536, people didn't just starve, they searched for meaning in the chaos. Across continents, cultures spun the catastrophe into stories that would echo for centuries. The Norse weren't merely describing winter when they spoke of Fimbulwinter. Their legends told of 3 years without summer, wolves devouring the sun, and brother turning against brother. These weren't random fantasies. They were cultural survival mechanisms, transforming raw trauma into narratives that could be passed down as warnings. Christian chroniclers framed the disaster differently but no less urgently. Bishop Gregory of Tours wrote of blood-colored rains and dragons in the sky, interpreting the events through the lens of divine judgment. In Constantinople, Mosaic artists abruptly shifted from depicting Christ as a gentle shepherd to portraying him as the stern Pantocrator, almighty judge of a suffering world. Even the date of Easter was controversially recalculated during this period, as if rearranging sacred time might restore cosmic order. The parallels between these mythologies reveal something profound. From Scandinavia to Mesopotamia, cultures separated by thousands of miles all described similar phenomena: unnatural cold, warfare among celestial bodies, and societal collapse. The Babylonian Talmud contains passages about the sun's light diminishing, as if behind a sieve, while Irish monks wrote of the sky vomiting ashes upon the earth. These weren't coincidental metaphors. They were independent witnesses describing the same planetary scale event through their own cultural lenses. Archaeology shows how deeply this trauma embedded itself. In Sweden, ritual deposits from this era suddenly include broken farming tools, likely sacrifices to appease angry gods when plows became useless. Anglo-Saxon burial sites reveal an uptick in deviant burials, where corpses were pinned with stones or buried face down, possibly reflecting fear that the dead might return to haunt the living during this unnatural time. Even children's toys from the period take on eerie tones. Byzantine dolls excavated in Greece show unusually gaunt facial features, as if playthings mirrored the hunger around them. Perhaps most telling is how these stories evolved over generations. The Norse Fimbulwinter legend eventually merged with Ragnarök, the end of all things, suggesting the disaster's memory grew even more apocalyptic with time. Similarly, Christian eschatological texts composed decades later often referenced 536's events as precursors to the Book of Revelation's prophecies. What began as first-hand accounts of weather anomalies had transformed, within just a few generations, into foundational elements of cultural cosmology. The endurance of these stories speaks to humanity's need to transform incomprehensible suffering into meaningful narrative. When 9th-century Viking skalds sang of Fimbulwinter, they weren't just entertaining, they were preserving ancestral trauma as a cautionary tale. When Byzantine mothers told children about the dark sun years, they were encoding survival knowledge: how to store extra grain, which wild plants could be eaten, why communities must stick together. These myths became living textbooks for enduring catastrophe. Modern psychology recognizes this pattern. Societies that experience collective trauma often develop cultural antibodies, stories, rituals, and art that help process grief and prepare for future crises. The parallels between 536's global folklore and modern disaster narratives are striking. Our own tales of nuclear winter or climate collapse serve similar purposes, making the unthinkable manageable by giving it structure and meaning. What makes 536 unique is the sheer universality of its cultural imprint. From Maya codices to Japanese chronicles, the event left fingerprints on humanity's collective imagination like no other natural disaster before the modern era. These stories are more than historical curiosities. They're proof of our species' remarkable ability to alchemize terror into art, despair into wisdom. When we read these ancient accounts today, we're not just learning about the past, we're witnessing the moment our ancestors stared into the abyss and chose to sing about it. The collapse of trade networks during the 536 crisis wasn't just an economic footnote, it was the unraveling of an ancient world order. Picture the Roman roads that once pulsed with merchants and soldiers, now eerily silent except for the creak of abandoned carts. Mediterranean ports that had buzzed with activity for centuries stood nearly empty, their docks rotting under ash-gray skies. This wasn't merely a recession, it was the disintegration of systems that had sustained civilizations for generations, leaving societies scrambling to reinvent how they survived. At the heart of this collapse lay agriculture's failure. With crops withering across continents, the commodities that fueled long-distance trade simply vanished. Egyptian grain ships stopped sailing to Constantinople, their holds no longer filled with the golden wheat that fed the empire. Spanish olive oil, once shipped in delicate glass amphorae to every corner of the Mediterranean, became so scarce that lamps across Europe reverted to animal fat. Even luxury trades like Chinese silk faltered when mulberry trees froze, starving the silkworms that had been carefully cultivated along the Silk Road for centuries. The economic domino effect was catastrophic. Without steady harvests, farmers couldn't pay taxes. Without taxes, empires couldn't maintain armies or infrastructure. Byzantine gold coins, the dollar of their day, began disappearing from circulation as governments hoarded precious metals to buy emergency food supplies. In Rome, archaeologists find layers from this period where broken pottery gets crudely repaired instead of replaced, a silent testament to how even basic goods became irreplaceable. Regional economies adapted in desperate ways. In northern Gaul, blacksmiths suddenly stopped producing decorative brooches and focused solely on forging basic tools, their artistry sacrificed to survival. Scandinavian traders who once dealt in amber and furs pivoted to trafficking in salt, now more valuable than gold for preserving what little food remained. The famous Tabula Peutingeriana, a Roman road map from this era, shows routes abruptly ending at what were once thriving market towns, their names crossed out by later hands. What made this breakdown historically significant was its permanence. Unlike temporary disruptions from wars or local famines, 536's damage to trade networks proved irreversible in many regions. The Indian Ocean spice trade took nearly a century to recover its former volume. Roman glassmaking techniques, dependent on stable temperatures impossible during the volcanic winters, disappeared from some regions entirely. Most tragically, the knowledge networks that had connected thinkers from Athens to Alexandria frayed beyond repair. The last librarians at the Villa of the Papyri in Herculaneum may have frozen to death while trying to burn priceless scrolls for warmth. The human cost of this economic apocalypse reveals itself in unexpected places. Tax records from Byzantine Egypt show entire villages declaring themselves without means, a bureaucratic euphemism for total destitution. In Britain, post-Roman hill forts suddenly show evidence of industrial-scale metal recycling, as people melted down everything from door hinges to religious artifacts for scrap. Even language bears scars of this collapse. The Old English word, wick, once meaning a thriving trade settlement, gradually shifted to signify abandoned place in the century after 536. Yet amid the ruins, glimmers of innovation emerged. Some Mediterranean communities developed primitive futures markets, trading promises of next year's olive harvests when the trees finally bore fruit again. In Persia, merchants pioneered early forms of insurance, pooling resources to protect caravan routes against bandits and bad weather. Most remarkably, dendrochronology reveals that Norse shipbuilders began constructing lighter, faster vessels during this period, an adaptation that may have laid the groundwork for the Viking longships that would dominate trade centuries later. These economic aftershocks extended far beyond mere numbers. When the Roman solidus stopped circulating in Western Europe, it didn't just impoverish merchants, it erased a common economic language that had unified the Mediterranean world. Local barter systems replaced coinage in many areas, making long-distance commerce nearly impossible. A Byzantine merchant traveling to Gaul in the 540s would have found no banks to change money, no inns guaranteeing safe passage, and often no buyers for goods that had been precious commodities just a decade earlier. The greatest tragedy may be how this economic collapse amplified every other disaster. Starving populations couldn't flee plague zones because trade routes no longer functioned to bring them food elsewhere. Knowledge of medicinal plants died with herbalists who could no longer travel to gather specimens. Even simple technologies like watermill maintenance faded in some regions when specialist craftsmen starved or migrated. What began as a climate event became an economic one, then a cultural one, each collapse making the next inevitable. Modern economists see eerie parallels in this ancient catastrophe. The specialization that makes civilizations efficient also makes them vulnerable. When trade networks fail, societies built on interdependence crumble fastest. The lesson of 536 isn't just about surviving disaster, but about recognizing how deeply our fates remain woven together across continents and centuries. When those threads snap, the unraveling can last longer than anyone anticipates, not just years, but generations. The darkness eventually lifted from the skies, but the shadows it cast across human economies would take far longer to disperse. When crops failed and bodies piled up in the streets, the social contract between rulers and the ruled shattered like thin ice. Across the 6th century world, kings and emperors discovered a brutal truth: no amount of gold or soldiers could command loyalty from people watching their children starve. The Eastern Roman Emperor Justinian, whose name would later define the plague, faced revolts not from ambitious generals but from bread riots in Constantinople itself. His grand vision of reuniting the Roman Empire crumbled as legions meant for conquest were instead deployed to guard grain convoys against desperate citizens. Political dominoes fell fastest where legitimacy was already fragile. In Merovingian Gaul, rival Frankish kings blamed each other for the unending disasters, their civil wars escalating even as villages emptied from hunger. Anglo-Saxon chronicles tell of petty kings deposed by their own huskarls' bodyguards who refused to starve while royal storehouses still held food. Perhaps most telling are the archaeological remains of 6th century palaces across Europe and the Middle East. Unlike cities destroyed by war, these show no signs of violent attack. Instead, their abandonment appears gradual but total, as if entire courts simply dissolved into the starving populace. Nowhere was this collapse more consequential than in the Sasanian Empire. Persian rulers had long justified their power through Zoroastrianism's cosmic struggle between light and darkness. But when the sun itself seemed to betray them, their authority crumbled. Tax collectors stopped venturing into rebellious provinces, and fire temples recorded plunging donations. Within decades, this weakened Persia would fall to Arab conquerors, a seismic shift often attributed to military defeat, but rooted in the political rot of 536's aftermath. The crisis exposed a fundamental flaw in ancient governance. From China to Ireland, states relied on what historians call the moral economy, the unspoken promise that rulers would ensure basic survival in exchange for obedience. When emperors couldn't deliver bread or stop plague carts from piling corpses outside city walls, that covenant broke irreparably. Byzantine legal codes from the 540s suddenly include frantic edicts against price gouging and hoarding, revealing how deeply fear had infected the halls of power. Some leaders adapted with startling innovation. In southern China, the Liang dynasty's Emperor Wu, a devout Buddhist, transformed pagodas into grain distribution centers and ordered monasteries to compile medical texts on famine diseases. His hybrid of spiritual and practical response likely saved thousands, though it couldn't prevent his dynasty's eventual collapse. Similarly, The Visigothic king Theudes in Hispania took the unprecedented step of granting land directly to peasant militias who could defend their own harvests, bypassing the crumbling aristocracy. These experiments hint at roads not taken alternative political models that might have flourished in less catastrophic times. The most enduring political legacy may be how the disaster reshaped the very concept of power. Before 536, rulers derived authority from divine mandate or military might. Afterward, successful states increasingly emphasized pragmatic competence, the ability to manage crises. The Eastern Roman Empire's survival, precarious as it was, owed much to bureaucrats who created detailed plague response manuals and standardized quarantine procedures. Meanwhile, kingdoms that clung to old models of glory and conquest, like the Ostrogoths in Italy, vanished into history's footnotes. Modern parallels are hard to ignore. Just as 6th century leaders faced revolts when grain ships failed, today's governments grapple with unrest when supply chains fracture or vaccines distribute unevenly. The lesson written in ash and parchment is clear. Political systems aren't judged in times of plenty, but in moments when the sky darkens and the earth refuses to yield. 536 didn't just change who ruled, it changed what people expected from those who dared to claim the throne. The creative spark that had illuminated antiquity's greatest achievements flickered and nearly died in those dark years. When Procopius wrote that men forgot the arts altogether, he wasn't exaggerating. Archaeological layers from 536 to the 550s reveal a stunning absence of the pottery, jewelry, and tools that usually mark human cultural activity. In Constantinople, the great mosaic workshops fell silent, their intricate glass tesserae replaced by crude daubs of paint when materials became scarce. The Hagia Sophia, Justinian's architectural masterpiece completed just before the catastrophe, stood as a lonely beacon in a landscape of abandoned construction projects. This wasn't merely an artistic drought, it represented a rupture in the transmission of knowledge. Greek fire, the Byzantines' legendary naval weapon, disappeared from historical records during this period, likely because the master chemists who understood its formulation perished without apprentices. Roman concrete recipes, perfected over centuries, suddenly became hit or miss as surviving builders worked from imperfect memory. Even basic literacy rates plummeted. Analysis of wax tablets from the era shows handwriting growing increasingly erratic, then vanishing altogether from some regions for generations. The archaeological record paints a haunting picture of regression. In Britain, post-Roman metalworkers reverted to simpler iron smelting techniques abandoned centuries earlier. Mediterranean shipbuilders stopped producing the complex lateen sails that had powered imperial trade, returning to square rigs that were easier to construct but far less efficient. Most telling are the pottery shards where 5th century layers show elaborate glazes and fine decorations. Mid-6th century fragments become thicker, cruder, and often reused multiple times before final discard. Literature suffered perhaps the cruelest blow. The vibrant tradition of classical scholarship that had survived Rome's fall nearly vanished in this decade. Alexandria's great library, already diminished, lost its last connection to the Hellenistic intellectual tradition when the scholar Olympiodorus the Younger died without successors. In Europe, monastic scribes stopped copying secular works altogether, focusing solely on reproducing religious texts they believed might ward off divine wrath. The loss is incalculable. How many plays of Sophocles, treatises of Archimedes, or histories of Livy might have survived had 536 not severed the chain of transmission. Yet amid this stagnation, flickers of resilience emerged. Some monastic communities became unexpected arcs of knowledge, their self-sufficient design allowing them to preserve texts while cities crumbled. The Irish monastery at Clonmacnoise shows evidence of continuous manuscript production through the worst years, its scribes working by fish oil lamps when beeswax became unobtainable. In Persia, the Academy of Gondishapur secretly continued astronomical observations, their star charts noting the sun's dimmed luminosity with scientific detachment despite the chaos around them. The most profound impact may have been on medicine. Galen's sophisticated theories of humoral balance gave way to desperate folk remedies as trained physicians died in plague wards. Byzantine hospital records show a sudden reliance on prayer over procedure, while Anglo-Saxon burial sites reveal skeletons with amateurish bone-setting attempts that often worsened injuries. This medical dark age would haunt Europe for centuries. When the Black Death struck 800 years later, doctors had barely regained the knowledge lost in 536's aftermath. What makes this intellectual freeze so tragic is its timing. Just before the catastrophe, the Eastern Roman Empire had been experiencing a cultural renaissance under Justinian. Law, architecture, and philosophy were reaching new heights. The disaster didn't just pause progress, it erased foundations, forcing survivors to rebuild knowledge from fragments. When creative expression finally re-emerged in the late 6th century, it bore scars of trauma. Byzantine art became more rigid and hierarchical. Norse sagas turned darker in tone. Chinese poetry fixated on themes of impermanence. This lost decade poses unsettling questions about civilization's fragility. The same specialization that allows cultural flowering master glassmakers, trained architects, literate bureaucrats makes societies vulnerable when those knowledge chains break. Modern researchers poring over palimpsests, medieval manuscripts scraped clean and rewritten, sometimes find ghostly traces of classical texts erased during this desperate era, poignant reminders of how much was sacrificed to simple survival. The darkness that fell in 536 wasn't just atmospheric, it was the shadow of forgetting, a warning that human achievement remains perpetually one catastrophe away from vanishing into the void. When the sun dimmed to a sickly glow, faith became both a lifeline and a source of terror. Across continents, priests and shamans scrambled to interpret the heavens' ominous message. Was this divine punishment, a cosmic warning, or the beginning of the end? In Constantinople, Patriarch Minas ordered 7 days of penitential processions, his priests carrying icons through streets where ash fell like unnatural snow. Meanwhile, in the Maya city of Tikal, astrologers etched dire prophecies into stelae, interpreting the haze as the breath of the death god Apuch. These weren't isolated reactions. From Zoroastrian fire temples to Buddhist monasteries, the same desperate question echoed. What had humanity done to anger the skies? The answers reshaped religions themselves. Christian sermons from this period reveal a striking shift where earlier texts emphasized God's mercy. 5th century homilies now thundered about impending judgment. Byzantine hymnography suddenly overflowed with references to the darkened sun from the Book of Revelation, while Irish monks added apocalyptic marginalia to their illuminated manuscripts. In Persia, Zoroastrian texts like the Bundahishan linked the event to Ahriman's final assault on creation, urging followers to purify themselves through ever more extreme rituals. Archaeology confirms these accounts. Excavation of a 6th century church in Antioch uncovered an altar buried under layers of soot, surrounded by hundreds of votive offerings, tiny lead scrolls inscribed with pleas for forgiveness. What's fascinating is how these interpretations dictated real-world survival strategies. Jewish communities in the Levant, interpreting the disaster through the lens of Jeremiah's prophecies, established elaborate food-sharing networks modeled on ancient Sabbath year traditions. Norse sagas recount how chieftains ordered massive sacrifices at Uppsala, not just animals, but sometimes humans seeking to rekindle the sun's strength. In China, Taoist adepts distributed talismans claiming to purify poisoned winds, while imperial decrees mandated daily recitations of the Diamond Sutra to appease angry heavens. These weren't just symbolic gestures, they were crisis management systems, offering structure when the natural world seemed to collapse. The psychological toll of these interpretations lingers in cultural DNA. Modern doomsday cults still invoke imagery from this era: the darkened sun, the blood-colored moon, unaware they're echoing 6th century trauma. Even secular disaster movies unconsciously replicate the motifs. The priest surveying ruined cities in the Seventh Seal owes much to Gregory of Tours' Plague Chronicles. Perhaps most haunting are the folk traditions that persisted for centuries. In Balkan villages as late as the 19th century, farmers performed sun-strengthening rituals every March, lighting bonfires to help the spring sun rise higher, a faint echo of their ancestors' terror when it nearly failed to rise at all. Yet amid the fear, these religious responses also reveal humanity's resilience. The same catastrophe that inspired dread also birthed revolutionary compassion. Buddhist monasteries from Gandhara to Nara opened their storehouses unconditionally, citing the parable of the hungry tigress. Christian hospices, originally designed for pilgrims, pivoted to plague care, their volunteers hazmat-like waxed robes anticipating modern PPE by 14 centuries. And in a poignant twist, some of history's first recorded interfaith collaborations emerged from the crisis. Letters survive between rabbis in Babylon and Nestorian Christians in Persia, comparing scriptural interpretations of the disaster while sharing medical advice. When the sky itself seemed vengeful, the best of humanity still found ways to reach across divides, not just to survive, but to remind one another that light existed beyond the ash. The ground beneath our feet holds secrets more chilling than any ancient text. Across Europe and Asia, archaeologists brush away centuries of soil to uncover a world frozen in crisis: charred grain stores filled with unharvested wheat, homes abandoned with meals still on the table, and mass graves where bodies were stacked like firewood. At a site in Bavaria, researchers found a family buried mid-meal, their skeletal hands still clutching bowls of half-eaten gruel mixed with tree bark. Nearby, the bones of a child showed signs of rickets, a disease of severe malnutrition that twists limbs like pretzels. These aren't just artifacts, they're snapshots of the moment 536's horror became inescapable. Some of the most telling evidence comes from what's missing. In once thriving Roman villas across Gaul, archaeologists note the sudden disappearance of imported goods: no more African red slip pottery, no Syrian glassware. Instead, layers from this period contain crudely patched cookware and tools made from recycled metal. At the Roman city of Vindolanda near Hadrian's Wall, barracks meant for hundreds of soldiers held barely a dozen at the crisis's peak, their trash heaps revealing an alarming shift from beef bones to rodent remains. Even the rats were starving. The graves tell their own harrowing story. Unlike orderly Roman cemeteries with inscribed tombstones, 536-era burial sites show panic etched into the earth. In Kent, England, a pit held 17 bodies tossed haphazardly, their teeth marked by the telltale horizontal lines of chronic starvation. Near Ephesus, a mass grave contained victims of the Justinian plague, their bones pocked by lesions from bubonic infection, many showing signs they'd survived famine only to succumb to disease. Most heartbreaking are the infant burials. Across multiple sites, tiny skeletons appear in disproportionate numbers, some with stomach cavities containing nothing but gritty clay, the desperate, famine food their parents hoped might sustain them. But it's not just human remains that bear witness. Pollen analysis from lake beds shows an eerie transformation where 5th century samples burst with grains from cultivated crops. Mid-6th century layers contain mostly weed spores. In Ireland's bogs, perfectly preserved shoes from this period show unusual repairs, the leather stretched thin from constant wear as people walked farther in search of food. Even animal bones tell a story of societal collapse. At a Visigothic settlement in Spain, dog skeletons from this period show butcher marks, suggesting pets became protein sources. Perhaps the most chilling finds are the abandoned cities. Tukul's great plazas, once bustling with Mayan merchants, were suddenly empty by the mid-6th century, their last dated stelae bearing ominous weather references. In Scandinavia, entire villages along fjords show signs of being vacated overnight, fishing nets left to rot, forge fires banked but never relit. The Roman port city of Ostia, vital to feeding the empire, shrank to a fraction of its size, its grain warehouses repurposed as makeshift tombs. These silent ruins contradict the old notion that civilizations decline gradually. The archaeology of 536 shows collapse can happen at terrifying speed, a single generation watching their world unravel. Modern technology lets us read these ruins with heartbreaking intimacy. Soil chemistry reveals where desperate farmers overworked depleted fields, their crops withering in acidified earth. Skeletal isotopes trace migration patterns. Some Anglo-Saxon remains in England show childhood origins as far away as the Danube, suggesting entire families fled stricken homelands only to perish in new ones. At a Norwegian farmstead, laser scans detected the faint outline of a vegetable garden hastily planted over a child's grave, the ultimate symbol of hope persisting amidst despair. These archaeological whispers force us to confront an uncomfortable truth. The written records describe emperors and plagues, but the dirt tells the people's story, the anonymous millions who starved in the shadows of history. Their bones bear no inscriptions, their homes left no chronicles. Yet through the patient work of trowels and microscopes, we're finally hearing their voices across 15 centuries. They warn us that civilization is more fragile than we dare admit, and that the line between prosperity and ruin can vanish as quickly as sunlight behind volcanic ash. While volcanoes bear the brunt of blame for 536's nightmare skies, another silent player may have lurked overhead: the sun itself. Solar physicists examining ice core data have noticed something peculiar. The mid-6th century coincided with a period of unusually low solar activity, what we now call a grand solar minimum. During these phases, the sun's magnetic field weakens, allowing more cosmic rays to penetrate Earth's atmosphere. These high-energy particles from deep space don't just create auroras, they can seed clouds, reflecting even more sunlight back into space and amplifying cooling effects. The evidence hides in tree rings and ice. Samples from this era show spikes in beryllium-10, an isotope produced when cosmic rays strike the atmosphere, a telltale sign of heightened cosmic bombardment. While not as dramatic as volcanic sulfate layers, these markers suggest the sun wasn't merely a passive observer during the crisis. Climate models indicate that even a modest solar minimum could have dropped global temperatures by an additional ½ degree Celsius, enough to turn difficult growing conditions into outright catastrophe for crops already struggling under volcanic ash. What makes this cosmic connection eerie is how it mirrors ancient anxieties. Byzantine chroniclers wrote of strange lights in the darkened skies, possibly enhanced auroras from the solar slump. Norse sagas described the sun as sickly long before the Fimbulwinter legends took shape. Even Chinese astronomers recorded an unusual number of guest stars, likely supernova, whose radiation may have further disturbed atmospheric chemistry. The sky wasn't just blocked, it was fundamentally altered, with multiple celestial actors conspiring against Earth's climate. Critics argue these factors were background noise compared to volcanic forcing, and they're not wrong. The sulfur from eruptions like Ilopango would have dwarfed solar effects under normal circumstances, but 536 wasn't normal. Like a house of cards, Earth's climate system had been destabilized, and the solar minimum may have been the final breeze that brought it crashing down. Farmers watching their wheat freeze in August wouldn't have cared whether the culprit was a volcano or the sun. The result was the same, a world where every sunrise felt less like hope and more like a taunt. Modern parallels add urgency to these findings. The 17th century Maunder minimum, another solar quiet period, coincided with the Little Ice Age's worst winters. Today, as scientists monitor our own sun's unpredictable cycles, the lesson of 536 looms large. When terrestrial and cosmic disasters align, their combined impact can rewrite civilizations. The dimmed sky wasn't just geological bad luck. It was a perfect storm where Earth's fury met the indifference of the cosmos. History has witnessed other volcanic winters, but none quite like the nightmare of 536. Take 1815's eruption of Mount Tambora in Indonesia, often cited as the most powerful in recorded history. The following year became infamous as the year without a summer, when frosts in June killed crops across New England and Europe. Snow fell in July as far south as Virginia, and famine rippled across continents. Yet for all its devastation, Tambora's effects lasted barely 18 months, a blink compared to the decade-long shadow cast by 536. The difference lies in the scale and persistence of the atmospheric assault. Tambora ejected an estimated 160 cubic kilometers of material, while 536's eruptions, likely multiple volcanoes acting in concert, may have surpassed that volume. More crucially, ice core data reveals that 536's sulfate aerosols didn't just linger. They were continuously replenished by subsequent eruptions, creating a self-sustaining climate shock. Where Tambora was a single hammer blow, 536 was a relentless beating. Krakatoa's 1883 explosion offers another telling contrast. Its ash clouds painted sunsets so vivid that Edvard Munch's The Scream may have captured their eerie glow. Global temperatures dropped by over 1 degree Celsius for 5 years, yet life largely adapted. The telegraph allowed news of the disaster to spread, and industrialized nations could transport relief supplies by rail and steamship. In 536, with no warning systems and subsistence farming dominating, societies lacked even these fragile buffers. A bad harvest didn't mean higher bread prices, it meant empty bellies and mass graves. Even more ancient eruptions pale in comparison. The Thara explosion around 1600 BC likely contributed to the collapse of Minoan civilization, but its effects were regional. The 50,000 BC Toba supereruption may have triggered a volcanic winter lasting years, but humanity's small, scattered population at the time made societal collapse impossible. There simply weren't complex societies to unravel. 536 struck at the worst possible moment, when civilizations from Constantinople to Teotihuacan had grown interconnected yet still depended utterly on each season's harvest. Modern modeling reveals why 536 stands alone. Climate simulations show that back-to-back eruptions in tropical latitudes, where 536's suspected Ilopango and other volcanoes erupted, have outsized global impact. Their aerosols get pumped into the stratosphere near the equator, where atmospheric circulation spreads them worldwide. Tambora and Krakatoa, both closer to the equator than most volcanoes, already packed extra punch. But 536's proposed multi-volcano barrage, would have been like detonating several Krakatoas in quick succession across the planet's waistline. The human toll underscores this disparity. 1816 saw food riots in Europe and failed harvests in China, but no recorded pandemics or mass migrations. Krakatoa's aftermath included dramatic sunsets and cooler summers, but no collapse of trade networks or dark age of knowledge. 536 didn't just bend societies, it broke them, triggering cascading failures from agriculture to governance to public health. Where later eruptions were disasters, 536 was an extinction-level event for entire ways of life. Yet these comparisons hold an ominous lesson. In our interconnected, climate-stressed world, even a single Tambora-scale eruption could now trigger global food shortages and economic chaos. The volcanoes haven't grown tamer, we've just been lucky. 536 reminds us that beneath Earth's thin crust sleeps a power capable of undoing centuries of progress in a handful of harvests. The dark sky of that terrible year wasn't an anomaly, it was a preview. The darkness eventually lifted, but the cold lingered like an uninvited guest refusing to leave. When scientists examine climate data from the centuries following 536, they find something startling: the volcanic winter didn't just last a decade. It may have kicked off a chain reaction that plunged much of the northern hemisphere into a prolonged chill, with temperatures staying well below normal for nearly 150 years. Tree rings from this period tell a grim story. Stunted growth, late springs, and early frosts became the new normal. Oaks that once added thick rings each summer now grew at a fraction of their former pace, their wood dense with the struggle to survive. This wasn't merely a bad stretch of weather. The sheer volume of sulfur dioxide pumped into the stratosphere likely triggered feedback loops that reshaped entire climate systems. One theory suggests the initial cooling expanded Arctic sea ice, which reflected more sunlight back into space, creating a self-sustaining cycle of cold. Ocean sediment cores from the North Atlantic show unusual amounts of ice-rafted debris during this period, hinting at icebergs venturing farther south than they had for centuries. Meanwhile, pollen samples from European bogs reveal dramatic shifts. Heat-loving plants like hazel and oak declined, while cold-tolerant species like birch and spruce surged. Ecosystems were rewriting their rulebooks in real time. The human cost of this mini-ice age reveals itself in unexpected ways. Byzantine tax records from the 600s show entire regions abandoning wheat, a crop that had thrived for centuries, in favor of hardier barley. In Scandinavia, archaeological sites suddenly feature more reindeer bones than cattle, suggesting pastoralists adapted by hunting rather than farming. Even the humble grape tells a story. Vineyards that once stretched across southern England vanished from the archaeological record, their owners unable to sustain warmth-loving vines in the new climate reality. Some of the most compelling evidence comes from the written word. Irish monastic chronicles, usually focused on kings and saints, suddenly fixate on unseasonable weather: snow in May, frozen lakes in June. A 9th-century Welsh poem laments summer in hiding, while Chinese court astronomers recorded an alarming increase in cold damage to rice paddies as far south as the Yangtze River. These weren't isolated complaints, they were the collective gasp of civilizations realizing the rules had changed. What makes this prolonged cooling so historically significant is how it reshaped human movement. The Lombard migration into Italy, the Slavic expansion into the Balkans, even the Arab conquests all coincided with this climatic downturn. Desperate populations abandoned marginal lands, triggering waves of displacement that redrew maps. In North America, the ancestral Pueblones began constructing their famous cliff dwellings around this time, possibly seeking shelter from harsher conditions on the plains. Climate wasn't just background noise, it was the unseen hand pushing societies toward crisis or reinvention. Modern climate models offer a sobering perspective. When researchers input 536's volcanic data into simulations, they see not just a temporary dip in temperatures, but a step decline like a thermostat ratcheted permanently lower. The eruptions may have disrupted the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, that critical conveyor belt of warm water that keeps Europe mild. If so, the sky's clearing didn't mean a return to normal. It meant adapting to a new, colder normal where growing seasons stayed shorter and storms grew fiercer. The lesson buried in this ancient climate data is uncomfortably relevant. Once certain thresholds are crossed, ice sheets expanding, ocean currents shifting, the effects can outlast their initial triggers by generations. The people who survived 536 didn't just endure a catastrophe. They inherited a transformed world, one where the memory of warm summers faded into legend, and survival meant learning to live in the long shadow of an angry sky. When the skies refused to clear and the earth turned against them, survival demanded more than endurance, it required reinvention. Across the shattered landscapes of 536, the quickest to adapt weren't always the strongest, but the most creative. In the Byzantine Empire, farmers who'd spent generations perfecting wheat rotations suddenly planted whatever would sprout: lentils, bitter vetch, even wild grasses normally considered weeds. Archaeologists sifting through 6th century grain silos find these desperate improvisations preserved like time capsules. Layers of drought-resistant millet nestled alongside acorns ground into flour, evidence of communities rewriting agricultural rules on the fly. Some adaptations bordered on genius. In the Alps, where frosts killed summer crops, villagers discovered that stacking stones around young plants created thermal mass, radiating enough residual warmth to prevent freezing. Chinese agricultural manuals from the period suddenly featured detailed instructions for pit cultivation, digging trenches lined with manure to generate heat for seedlings. The Maya, facing drought, engineered intricate systems to funnel dew into cisterns, while Norse fishermen shifted from open boats to constructing permanent weirs along suddenly ice-free fjords, trapping herring by the thousands. These weren't just survival tricks, they were revolutions in microclimate manipulation, proving humans could outthink nature even when outmuscled by it. Food storage became an art form. Roman granaries, designed for Mediterranean climates, proved useless in the damp cold. But in Cappadocia, engineers carved elaborate underground cities with ventilation shafts that kept grain dry for years. Their designs so effective modern engineers still study them. Irish monks developed a technique of burying butter in bogs, the anaerobic environment preserving it for decades, as evidenced by 500-pound bog butter caches still being unearthed today. Even the humble pickle got an upgrade. Byzantine households began using fermented grape leaves as antimicrobial wrappers, extending vegetable shelf life through winters that never seemed to end. The most profound shifts occurred in social structures. The old hierarchies, landowners hoarding surplus while peasants starved, proved deadly. Societies that survived often did so by flattening power. In Visigothic Spain, communal ovens appeared where bread was baked collectively rather than by household. Chinese Buddhist monasteries transformed into proto-socialist hubs, distributing food based on need rather than status. And in Scandinavia, the very concept of leadership changed. Sagas from this period celebrate figures not for their wealth or bloodlines, but for their skill at organizing fair food distribution during famines. These innovations left fingerprints on language itself. Old English acquired new words like hunger month for periods of scarcity, while Greek medical texts suddenly featured terms for malnutrition diseases previously rare in Mediterranean climates. Recipes changed too. Byzantine cookbooks from the late 6th century show a stark shift from delicate pastries to dense, calorie-packed loaves fortified with whatever proteins could be scavenged: locusts, snails, even crushed eggshells for calcium. What's remarkable isn't just that humanity survived, but how these adaptations echo into modernity. The Norse herring techniques birthed Scandinavia's fishing industries. Byzantine grain storage inspired medieval Europe's tithe barns, and that alpine stone stacking method, it's the ancestor of today's frost protection systems in vineyards. The darkest year forced innovations so effective they outlasted the crisis that birthed them, proof that necessity doesn't just mother invention, but midwives entire new ways of living. Perhaps the ultimate lesson lies in what didn't return when the skies cleared. Societies that had relied on monocrops learned the hard way to diversify. Leaders who'd hoarded resources found their people unwilling to restore old hierarchies. And everywhere, the memory of starvation lingered in cultural DNA. Irish Brehon laws later mandated emergency grain reserves, while Chinese imperial exams began testing candidates on famine relief strategies. The adaptations born in 536's crucible didn't just help people survive. They reshaped civilizations to be less fragile, more nimble, and forever wary of taking a bright sky for granted. Amid the chaos of darkened skies and crumbling empires, a handful of chroniclers kept their quills moving, not for kings or coin, but because they understood the weight of what they witnessed. Gregory of Tours, a Frankish bishop, penned his history of the Franks with hands that must have trembled as he described rains like blood and summers that never came. His words weren't dry historical notes. They were the gasps of a man watching his world unravel. Across the Mediterranean, John of Ephesus wrote by flickering lamplight, his Syriac ecclesiastical history detailing plague carts piled so high with corpses they blocked Constantinople's streets. These men didn't know they were writing for posterity. They were simply trying to make sense of a reality too horrific to bear silently. What makes their accounts extraordinary isn't just the details they preserved, but the raw humanity bleeding through the parchment. Gregory's passage about a mother trading her last silver spoon for moldy barley isn't just economic data. It's a moment frozen in anguish. John's description of priests collapsing mid-prayer in plague-stricken churches doesn't merely document mortality rates. It captures the spiritual despair of an era. Even their biases reveal deeper truths. When Gregory blames the disasters on moral decay, or John interprets them as divine punishment, we're seeing how trauma reshapes belief systems in real time. These weren't dispassionate observers. They were survivors grappling with the unthinkable. Their ink stains as much a part of the catastrophe as the ashfall they described. The sheer logistical feat of their record-keeping staggers modern imagination. In an age when parchment was scarce and literacy rare, these chroniclers often worked with makeshift materials. Archaeologists have found palimpsests scraped and reused manuscripts from this period where faint traces of weather reports or plague tallies lurk beneath later religious texts. At St. Catherine's Monastery in the Sinai, a 6th century ledger survives with meticulous notes about which monks succumbed to the coughing sickness, their names crossed out in rust-colored ink that might well be iron gall mixed with the scribe's own tears. Every word was hard-won, every line a defiance of oblivion. Their legacy extends far beyond factual accounts. These chroniclers preserved the emotional cadence of catastrophe. The way Gregory's prose grows increasingly fragmented as conditions worsen, or how John's descriptions of Constantinople's wealthy fleeing their plague-ridden mansions echo modern inequalities during crises. Even their omissions speak volumes. The near silence about children in many accounts hints at losses too painful to record, while sudden mentions of strange lights or singing from the sky suggest hallucinatory hunger visions creeping into official histories. Perhaps most crucially, these writers ensured the disaster wasn't sanitized by time. When Irish monks later copied Gregory's works, they added marginal sketches of gaunt figures, medieval emoticons conveying shared trauma across centuries. Byzantine scholars studying John's texts in the 9th century annotated passages with medicinal herbs that hadn't existed in his day, as if trying to heal the past's wounds retroactively. The chronicler's words became living things, evolving with each generation that needed to remember. Today, as scholars pore over these fragile manuscripts with multispectral imaging, they're finding even deeper layers. Hidden between lines about failed harvests are faint charcoal sketches, quick doodles of barren trees or skeletal animals, likely drawn by scribes who lacked words for what they saw. On one page, someone pressed a withered wheat stalk into the vellum, leaving a ghostly imprint. These aren't just historical documents, they're time capsules of human resilience, proof that even in civilization's darkest hour, someone refused to let the story end. The ashes of 536 may have settled 15 centuries ago, but their shadow stretches into our modern world with unnerving clarity. Today, as satellites track rising global temperatures and scientists warn of climate tipping points, that ancient catastrophe whispers a blunt truth: civilizations thrive or collapse based on their relationship with the sky. The volcanic winter of 536 didn't just cool the planet, it exposed how tightly human survival is tethered to delicate atmospheric balances we still barely control. Consider the parallels where 6th century farmers watched volcanic sulfur dim the sun. Modern agronomists now document how wildfire smoke and industrial particulates are altering sunlight's intensity over croplands. Ancient chroniclers described unseasonable frosts killing Mediterranean olive trees. Today's vintners battle the same phenomenon as warming climates disrupt traditional growing seasons. Even the social fractures feel familiar when Byzantine cities hoarded grain during famine. They mirrored modern nations stockpiling vaccines during pandemics, revealing how quickly solidarity crumbles under existential threat. The most urgent lesson lies in cascading failures. 536 proved that climate shocks rarely come alone. They trigger economic collapses, pandemics, and mass migrations in domino sequences. Modern models show similar risks. A single degree of warming might seem manageable until it melts permafrost, releasing methane that accelerates heating further. Like 6th century volcanoes, today's carbon emissions don't operate in isolation. They're loading the atmosphere with triggers for systemic collapse. Yet 536's survivors also offer blueprints for resilience. Their agricultural adaptations, diversifying crops, developing cold-resistant grains prefigure today's climate-smart farming. Their flattened social structures during crisis echo modern mutual aid networks that emerge during disasters. Even their cultural responses hold wisdom. The way Norse societies transformed trauma into sagas mirrors how contemporary communities use storytelling to process climate grief. What makes this ancient disaster uniquely instructive is its scale. Unlike localized tragedies, 536 was a planetary stress test, one that revealed how interconnected systems fail together. Today, with supply chains spanning continents and digital networks linking billions, our interdependence has only deepened. A drought in Brazil now raises bread prices in Cairo, just as 6th century ash clouds starved farmers from Gaul to Gujarat. The key difference: we have tools our ancestors lacked. Satellites monitor atmospheric changes in real time. Genetic engineering develops drought-resistant crops. International coalitions, however fragile, coordinate disaster responses. But technology alone won't save us unless paired with 536's hardest lesson, that civilizations survive not through dominance over nature, but through humility before its power. When the sky darkens again, whether from volcanic ash or climate chaos, it won't care about our borders, banks, or beliefs. It will test, as it always has, whether we've learned to adapt together rather than perish apart. Even with cutting-edge technology peeling back layers of Earth's history, 536 still guards its darkest secrets like a vault. Scientists can pinpoint sulfate spikes in ice cores and trace ash fragments across continents, yet the biggest questions defy easy answers. Take the mystery of multiple eruptions. Ice core samples show not one but 3 distinct sulfur spikes between 534 and 540. Some researchers argue this points to a terrifying domino effect, with volcanoes across the globe triggering one another like geological chain reactions. Others propose a single massive eruption with staggered bursts, its ash clouds circling the planet in waves. The difference isn't just academic. If separate volcanoes erupted independently, it suggests our planet's fiery hotspots are more interconnected than we ever imagined. Then there's the enigma of the prolonged cooling. Normally, volcanic aerosols rain out of the atmosphere within 2 or 3 years, but tree rings and sediment cores reveal depressed temperatures for over a decade, sometimes longer. One radical theory points to a cosmic double whammy: volcanic ash interacting with a concurrent solar minimum to create a self-sustaining climate feedback loop. Imagine Earth's atmosphere as a damaged mirror, first cracked by eruptions, then shattered further by weakened sunlight, each fracture compounding the last. Supporting this, Antarctic ice shows elevated beryllium-10 isotopes during this period, markers of heightened cosmic ray bombardment that could have seeded extra cloud cover. The stakes of these debates reach far beyond ancient history. Unraveling 536's mechanics could rewrite our understanding of climate resilience. Modern models struggle to explain why some volcanic winters fade quickly while others, like 536's, become entrenched. The answer may lie in overlooked feedback mechanisms, shifting ocean currents, disrupted jet streams, or even microbial changes in soils that alter carbon cycling. When researchers input 536's data into climate simulations, they often find standard parameters can't replicate the prolonged cooling. It's as if Earth systems crossed an invisible threshold that year, tumbling into a colder, stable state like a ball bearing settling into a new groove. Some of the most heated discussions center on geographical gaps in the evidence. Southeast Asian chronicles from this period are scarce, leaving scientists to piece together impacts from coral die-offs and submerged ruins. A recently discovered Javanese inscription mentions the sun swallowed by fog, but without precise dating, it's unclear if this refers to the same catastrophe. Similarly, African climate proxies like sediment cores from Lake Victoria show dramatic drought patterns around 540. But linking them definitively to the eruptions remains contentious. These blind spots matter because they could reveal whether the disaster was truly global or a Northern Hemisphere phenomenon with ripple effects. What makes these unresolved puzzles so compelling is their modern urgency. If a single eruption like Ilopango could destabilize climates for generations, what might happen today if multiple Arctic volcanoes erupted in quick succession? Or if human-induced warming collided with a grand solar minimum? 536 serves as a petri dish for studying worst-case scenarios, a time when Earth systems didn't just wobble but lurched violently off-kilter. Each ice core drilled, each tree ring measured, brings us closer to reading the warning signs etched into our planet's memory. The darkest year isn't just a relic. It's a test, and the questions we're racing to answer could determine whether we're doomed to repeat its horrors or finally learn from them. The darkened skies of 536 didn't just haunt the survivors, they seeped into the very fabric of human creativity, leaving stains that artists and writers would grapple with for centuries. Medieval doom paintings, those vivid depictions of apocalypse that adorned church walls across Europe, often featured skies choked with ash and fire, a visual echo of ancestral trauma passed down through generations. Look closely at the Last Judgment frescoes in Sicily's Palatine Chapel, painted centuries later, and you'll spot something unsettling. The damned aren't just burning in hellfire, they're choking under a sulfurous yellow haze that perfectly matches Byzantine descriptions of 536's poisoned atmosphere. These weren't generic hellscapes, they were cultural memories fossilized in pigment and plaster. Literature preserved the horror in equally visceral ways. The Old English poem The Wanderer, composed long after the disaster, still carries its shadow. The world beneath the skies is changed, the wine halls crumble, their lords lie low. Scholars once dismissed these lines as metaphorical lament, but dendrochronology now reveals that 6th century great halls across Britain did literally crumble, their massive oak beams showing signs of abrupt abandonment during the famine years. Even the epic Beowulf, set in Scandinavia, contains eerie parallels. When the hero battles Grendel under a sky where God's bright candle was extinguished, was the poet channeling old tales of Fimbulwinter. The timing fits. Oral traditions about the disaster would have still been fresh when the story first took shape. The legacy isn't confined to ancient texts. Modern novelists keep resurrecting 536 as a metaphor for existential dread. In The Road, Cormac McCarthy's ashen wastelands owe much to historical accounts of the disaster. His characters even scavenge canned goods from abandoned homes, mirroring 6th century peasants picking through Roman villas for forgotten grain stores. Even fantasy worlds bear its imprint. George R.R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire, the basis for Game of Thrones, features a multi-year winter called The Long Night, a clear nod to Norse legends born from 536's trauma. These aren't casual references, they're proof that certain catastrophes embed themselves so deeply in our collective psyche that they become narrative shorthand for ultimate despair. Visual artists continue the tradition. Anselm Kiefer's monumental ash paintings series deliberately uses volcanic debris to evoke what he calls the moment civilization holds its breath. One installation even incorporates lead books with charred edges, a direct reference to Byzantine accounts of scholars burning scrolls for warmth. Meanwhile, in Iceland, contemporary composer Anna Thorvaldsdottir's orchestral work Aeriality uses microtonal strings to recreate the eerie acoustics described in Norse sagas, the way sound carried strangely through the dust-choked air. These creators aren't just making art about disaster, they're using 536 as a lens to examine modern anxieties about climate collapse and pandemic. The most poignant survivals, though, may be in folk traditions. In parts of rural Sweden, elders still recite a peculiar nursery rhyme. The sun is sick, the moon is pale, bake your bread with nettles and kale. Botanists confirm the plants mentioned are famine foods documented in 6th century middens. Similarly, Balkan harvest festivals feature rituals where children wear masks of the dark sun, their faces painted with concentric circles mimicking Procopius' descriptions of the eclipsed solar disk. These aren't fossilized traditions, but living connections, proof that cultural memory can outlast empires, languages, even religions. What makes this artistic legacy so vital is its honesty. Unlike dry historical records, these works preserve the emotional truth of the disaster. The way a mother's hands shook as she ground acorns into flour, or the hollow eyes of monks copying scriptures by light they feared might never brighten again. When a modern novelist describes a character tasting ash on the wind, or a composer scores a symphony for rattling bones and sighing brass, they're not just creating, they're bearing witness across 15 centuries. The skies eventually cleared, but the art ensures we never forget how fragile civilization looks when the light begins to fade. The terror of 536 didn't fade with the ash. It etched itself into the collective unconscious of civilizations, a primal fear passed down like a cursed inheritance. Imagine generations raised on bedtime stories that weren't fairy tales but warnings. Norse mothers whispering of Fimbulwinter's return, Byzantine children taught to scan the horizon for unnatural sunsets, Chinese elders stockpiling seed grain, just in case. This wasn't mere superstition. It was the birth of cultural trauma, a seismic shift in how humanity perceived its place in the cosmos. Where ancient peoples had once seen nature as cyclical and predictable, 536 planted the horrifying idea that the sky itself could turn against them without warning. Archaeologists find this anxiety fossilized in unexpected places. Across medieval Europe, peasant homes from the 7th to 10th centuries often included famine rooms, hidden storage spaces walled off behind hearths, their cramped interiors still containing ancient caches of dried beans or millet. In Ireland, excavations of ring forts reveal layers where families buried precious seed grain beneath floorboards, a practice that continued into the 19th century. These weren't practical precautions, they were ritual behaviors like a soldier flinching at fireworks decades after war. The physical scars had healed, but the instinct to brace for catastrophe remained. The psychological imprint reveals itself most vividly in folklore. The Slavic myth of the Nav, a spectral underworld where the sun goes to die, gained terrifying new details after 536, with descriptions of air thick with the breath of the dead mirroring volcanic haze. Germanic tribes began depicting their sun goddess Sol riding a chariot pursued by a monstrous wolf, a metaphor for the creeping dread that light might again be swallowed. Even the Arthurian legend of the wasteland, where a blighted kingdom awaits redemption, may trace its roots to 6th century Britain's agricultural collapse. These stories served a critical function. They transformed incomprehensible suffering into narratives with structure and meaning, allowing trauma to be processed collectively across generations. Religious practices bear similar scars. Byzantine liturgy incorporated unprecedented prayers for deliverance from sudden darkness, while Zoroastrian fire rituals intensified, as if humans could compensate for the sun's failure through sacred flame. In Mesoamerica, the Maya began calculating calendar cycles with obsessive precision, desperate to predict and perhaps prevent another cosmic betrayal. This shift from faith in nature's benevolence to wary vigilance marked a fundamental change in the human psyche. The world was no longer a garden to cultivate, but a fragile veil stretched over chaos. Modern psychology recognizes this pattern. Studies of communities surviving catastrophic events from Hiroshima, survivors to Holocaust descendants show trauma-altering gene expression and behavioral patterns for generations. 536's legacy fits this model perfectly. The famine foods still foraged in rural Scandinavia during hard winters, the Mediterranean tradition of keeping a year's grain supply untouched for the lean times, even the Irish superstition that a red sunset foretells disaster, all are behavioral fossils of that ancient terror. Climate scientists now identify these as examples of cultural adaptation memory, survival knowledge so critical it gets woven into identity itself. Perhaps most haunting is how this trauma shaped governance. Chinese imperial examinations began testing candidates on famine relief strategies, while Viking law codes mandated communal grain stores be maintained at thrice the population's needs. The Byzantine themata military system, where soldiers farmed land in peacetime, was designed explicitly to prevent food shortages during sieges. These weren't just policies, they were civilization-scale coping mechanisms, institutionalized panic passed down through centuries. The darkest testament to 536's psychological grip lies in what didn't happen. For nearly a millennium after the disaster, Eurasian art almost never depicted clear blue skies without ominous symbolism, a hovering raven, a blood-tinged horizon. It's as if collective memory couldn't trust the light to stay. Even when Renaissance painters finally revived the practice, their luminous heavens often contained hidden storms on the distant horizon, a visual whisper of ancient fear. The sky had broken humanity's trust once. No amount of time could fully repair it. Today's scientists don't need time machines to peer into 536's nightmare skies. They've built something even more powerful. Hidden in laboratories worldwide, machines called mass spectrometers can analyze a single ice crystal from Greenland and detect volcanic sulfur isotopes older than the pyramids. These aren't just fancy microscopes, they're climate detectives solving 1,500-year-old cold cases. By vaporizing microscopic ice samples with lasers, researchers can read the chemical fingerprints of ancient eruptions like lines in a history book, distinguishing between volcanic events that medieval chroniclers lumped together as the end of days. The real game changer lies in how these technologies connect the dots. Satellite imaging now allows scientists to scan entire continents for geological scars invisible to the naked eye, like the faint caldera rim beneath El Salvador's Lake Ilopango, confirming it as 536's prime suspect. Back in the lab, neutron activation analysis can determine whether ash particles found in Swiss glaciers came from Central America or Iceland by measuring trace elements like iridium and zirconium. These techniques have turned what was once speculation into a detailed timeline. We now know the first eruption likely happened in early 536, with subsequent blows striking before societies could recover. Perhaps most astonishing are the climate models powered by supercomputers. Feed them data from ice cores, tree rings, and sediment layers, and they'll simulate how sulfur aerosols danced across the stratosphere, showing exactly why Europe froze while Asia dried out. Researchers recently made a chilling discovery this way. 536's volcanic winter may have been prolonged because the eruptions occurred near the equator, where atmospheric circulation spreads particles globally like a poison diffusing through veins. But this isn't just about solving ancient mysteries. The same tools predicting 536's weather patterns now forecast our climate future. When scientists input modern carbon levels into these models, the results echo that terrible year, not from volcanic ash, but from wildfire smoke and industrial pollutants. The lesson written in ancient ice is clear. Whether the threat comes from Earth or human hands, the atmosphere remembers. And thanks to these technological marvels, we're finally learning to read its warnings before it's too late. Yet for all their precision, these tools can't measure the human cost behind the data points. That requires something older than mass spectrometry. The words of survivors like Procopius, who wrote by flickering candlelight about a sun that lost its virtue. The true power of modern paleoclimatology lies in this fusion, cold data giving context to ancient anguish, while time-worn manuscripts remind us that behind every sulfate spike in an ice core, real people once looked skyward and trembled. Volcanic ash wasn't the only villain darkening the skies of 536. Scientists poring over ice core samples have uncovered something unexpected: thin layers of fine silicate dust mixed with the volcanic sulfates, particles too small and angular to have come from a typical eruption. These microscopic invaders tell a story of drought-stricken landscapes and withering winds, where parched soil lifted into the atmosphere like a second shroud over the sun. Climate models now suggest these dust veils may have amplified the cooling by up to 30%, turning a volcanic winter into something even more sinister. The mechanics of this dust-driven cooling reveal nature's cruel precision. Unlike volcanic aerosols that primarily reflect sunlight back into space, fine dust particles act like jagged mirrors, scattering light in all directions while also absorbing heat themselves. This creates a double whammy. Less solar energy reaches the ground while the upper atmosphere warms slightly, disrupting weather patterns further. Modern satellite data shows similar effects during massive dust storms like Mongolia's annual yellow dust events, where particulates from the Gobi Desert have been tracked crossing oceans and dimming sunlight as far away as North America. In 536, with multiple continents already reeling from drought, these wandering dust clouds likely smothered any hope of agricultural recovery. Some researchers propose an even more dramatic source for the dust: microscopic meteorite fragments. A team analyzing Greenland ice found abnormally high levels of nickel and iridium in layers dating to 536, elements rare in Earth's crust but common in asteroids. While no large impact crater from this period has been identified, it's possible a small asteroid or comet fragment disintegrated in the upper atmosphere, injecting vast amounts of pulverized space rock into the stratosphere. The Tunguska event of 1908 demonstrated how airbursts can flatten forests without leaving craters, and if a similar event occurred over the already stressed farmlands of Eurasia, the resulting dust could have pushed fragile ecosystems past the breaking point. The terrifying implication is that 536's suffering may have been a tag-team disaster. First, volcanic ash blotted out the sun and triggered drought. Then, withering winds lifted topsoil into the sky, while perhaps a cosmic visitor added extraterrestrial grit to the mix. Tree rings from this period show something telling. While growth stalled globally in 536, some regions experienced sudden rebounds only to crash again a few years later. This fits eerily well with the idea of multiple overlapping atmospheric insults, each wave of particulates resetting the climate's recovery clock. What makes this discovery so revolutionary is how it changes our view of historical climate disasters. For decades, scientists treated volcanic eruptions as standalone events. Now, evidence suggests they often work in concert with other atmospheric phenomena: dust storms, wildfire smoke, even space dust, to create compound catastrophes. Modern climate models that once focused solely on greenhouse gases are beginning to incorporate these aerosol feedback loops, recognizing that the real danger lies in how different particles interact. The skies of 536 weren't just darkened, they became a toxic cocktail where every ingredient made the others more potent. The lesson for our own climate crisis is stark. Just as ancient farmers couldn't have imagined that drought dust would compound volcanic cooling, we're only beginning to grasp how wildfire smoke might interact with industrial pollution or melting permafrost. 536 stands as a grim reminder that Earth systems don't operate in isolation. When one thread frays, the whole tapestry can unravel in ways no one anticipates. The dust motes trapped in 1,500-year-old ice aren't just geological curiosities, they're warning signs written in the finest print, waiting for us to read them. The catastrophe of 536 didn't just bend civilizations, it shattered some beyond repair. Take the Western Roman Empire, already teetering when the skies darkened. With grain shipments from Egypt and North Africa disrupted by freak storms and failing harvests, Rome's urban populations faced starvation within months. Tax revenues collapsed as farmland turned fallow, leaving the empire unable to pay its frontier armies. Germanic tribes themselves fleeing climate chaos farther north found weakened garrisons at the Rhine and Danube borders. By 546, just a decade after the disaster began, large swaths of Italy had fallen to Lombard invaders while plague ravaged the remaining cities. What generations of barbarian attacks couldn't accomplish, 536's climate shocks achieved almost overnight, the final unmaking of antiquity's greatest superpower. Across the Atlantic, the Maya collapse shows eerily similar patterns. Before the disaster, cities like Tikal and Calakmul boasted populations in the tens of thousands, their stone temples covered in vibrant stucco. Then the drought came. Sediment cores from Lake Chichancanab reveal rainfall dropped by nearly 70% during this period, precisely when Maya inscriptions suddenly shift from royal proclamations to desperate prayers for rain. The last dated monument at the great city of Palenque appears in 539, its final glyphs speaking of black skies and empty granaries. Within a generation, jungle vines swallowed plazas where mathematicians once calculated the orbits of Venus. What makes these collapses so chilling is their simultaneity. While Rome's fall dominates European histories, Mesoamerican chronicles tell nearly identical stories of ruling classes losing their divine mandate when they couldn't make the rains return. In both hemispheres, the same sequence unfolded. Climate stress triggered food shortages, which sparked peasant revolts against elites, which then left societies vulnerable to invasion or abandonment. The Maya didn't vanish, they simply walked away from cities that no longer functioned, just as Roman citizens abandoned aqueducts they could no longer maintain. Yet the disaster didn't treat all civilizations equally. The Eastern Roman Empire, though battered, survived by radical adaptation. Emperor Justinian slashed bureaucracy, redirected taxes to grain imports, and transformed churches into food distribution centers. Meanwhile, in China, the Liang dynasty collapsed not from invasion, but because its Confucian bureaucracy couldn't comprehend a world where celestial harmony had broken. Their meticulous records describe ministers still debating ritual protocols while peasants ate bark outside palace walls. The lesson written in these contrasting fates is clear. When the sky rebels, ideological rigidity becomes as deadly as any sword. Archaeology reveals the human scale of these collapses. In former Roman Britain, 6th century burials show average heights dropped by nearly 2 inches from malnutrition, a biological testament to systemic failure. Maya mass graves contain nobles buried with commoners, their jade ornaments worthless against starvation. Perhaps most telling are the breach layers found in city walls across Eurasia, not from enemy battering rams, but from desperate citizens tunneling through to escape plague-stricken urban traps. The debate among historians isn't whether 536 changed civilizations, but how permanently. Some argue places like Constantinople demonstrated resilience through centralized response. Others point to the disappearance of entire languages, technologies, and artistic traditions as proof of irreversible loss. What's undeniable is that the world emerging from that decade looked fundamentally different, not just politically, but in how societies remembered their own fragility. When the Byzantine historian Procopius wrote that men became like beasts, he wasn't describing barbarians at the gates, but the moment when the contract between civilization and nature was irrevocably broken. The Great Migrations sparked by 536's catastrophe weren't aimless wanderings, they were desperate marches toward survival, reshaping continents like invisible hands kneading clay. Picture Lombard tribes abandoning the frozen Danube basin for Italy's ravaged but warmer valleys, their ox carts laden with frostbitten children and the last seed grain. Or Saxon boatloads crossing to Britain, not as conquerors but as climate refugees, drawn by rumors of abandoned Roman farms where the soil might still yield something edible. These movements didn't just change maps, they rewired human geography, blending languages, customs, and bloodlines under the pressure of a shared existential threat. Archaeology reveals the scale of this upheaval in poignant detail. In the Alps, abandoned villages show cooking pots left on hearths, as if families intended to return after a brief evacuation that became permanent. Along the Rhine, burial sites suddenly contain artifacts from hundreds of miles apart. A Frankish warrior buried with a Byzantine coin, a Celtic torque beside a Gothic spear tip. These weren't battle trophies, but evidence of communities forged through shared desperation. Even DNA tells the story. Studies of medieval skeletons showed genetic mixing during this period, far exceeding anything in previous centuries, as survival trumped ancient tribal divisions. The most dramatic shifts occurred on civilization's edges. In Scandinavia, entire coastal communities took to their longships, not for plunder but because fishing grounds had shifted with cooling currents. Their descendants would become the Vikings, but their first voyages were acts of starvation avoidance, not conquest. Similarly, the Slavic expansion southward into the Balkans wasn't an invasion so much as a slow seepage, families following receding tree lines and game trails as the climate shifted around them. Byzantine chroniclers wrote of forest folk appearing at city gates, not with weapons but with hollow cheeks and hands outstretched. What made these migrations historically unique was their self-reinforcing nature. As groups moved, they displaced others, creating domino effects that rippled across continents. The Avars pushing into Central Europe forced the Gepids westward, who in turn pressured the Lombards to cross the Alps. This chain reaction reached as far as North Africa, where Berber tribes displaced by drought migrated toward Roman coastal cities, straining already fragile food systems. The result was a planet-wide game of musical chairs with no region left untouched by the human tide. Cultural boundaries blurred in the chaos. In Brittany, Celtic refugees from Britain's famine intermarried with local Gallo-Romans, creating a hybrid culture evident in their unique standing stones, Latin inscriptions carved in Ogham script. Along the Volga River, Norse traders adopted Turkic horsemanship techniques to survive the steppes, while their counterparts in Constantinople assimilated Greek customs so thoroughly that within generations their Scandinavian origins faded into myth. This wasn't conquest through swords, but survival through synthesis, the birth of new identities from the ashes of old ones. The long-term consequences still echo today. Modern linguistic maps of Europe show startling correlations with 6th century migration routes. The sharp divide between Romance and Germanic languages traces almost exactly to where climate refugees encountered entrenched populations. Place names tell their own stories. Saxon shore sites in England mark landing points of hungry families, not warlords. Even culinary traditions bear the scars. The sudden prevalence of fermented fish in inland European diets during this period reveals coastal peoples bringing preservation techniques to new homelands. Perhaps the most profound legacy lies in what these migrants carried unseen. Norse sagas preserving memories of Fimbulwinter traveled with them to Iceland. Byzantine agricultural techniques smuggled out by fleeing monks eventually reached Ireland's monasteries. The trauma of displacement became encoded in cultural DNA, manifesting in everything from German folklore about hunger spirits to the Welsh tradition of storing a year's grain beneath floorboards. These weren't just people moving from point A to point B, they were living archives of catastrophe, their very presence altering the genetic and cultural landscapes they entered. The lesson for our era of climate migration is unmistakable. When the land can no longer sustain its people, borders become meaningless. The great movements of the Dark Ages didn't respect imperial decrees or ethnic purity. They followed the brutal logic of survival, rewriting human geography in ways no ruler could foresee. As rising seas and expanding deserts displace millions today, 536's refugees whisper across the centuries. Civilization's greatest transformations often begin not with a war cry, but with the sound of hungry feet on the move. The bones tell stories no chronicle could capture: rib cages warped like baskets from scurvy, skulls pocked with the sponge like lesions of anemia, leg bones bowed under the weight of bodies deprived of basic nutrition. These skeletal remains are more than archaeological finds. They are biological archives of suffering, etched into calcium and marrow. Take the mass graves unearthed near Trier, Germany. Of 200 skeletons dated to the 540s, over 80% show telltale signs of chronic malnutrition. Horizontal grooves in tooth enamel, called Harris lines, mark periods when growth literally paused from starvation. Pelvic bones exhibit porotic hyperostosis, a condition where the body, desperate for iron, dissolves its own bones from the inside out. These weren't just victims of a bad harvest, they were casualties of a broken food system that left them scraping bark for vitamins and eating clay to quiet stomach cramps. But malnutrition was only the beginning. Weakened immune systems created perfect conditions for epidemics to flourish. Tuberculosis, normally a slow-moving disease, became a swift executioner in crowded refugee camps. Leprosy cases spiked as vitamin D deficiency made skin more vulnerable to infection. Even dental records reveal hidden horrors: adults with teeth worn down to the pulp from chewing fibrous famine foods, children with jaws deformed by rickets. The most haunting evidence comes from infant remains. Isotope analysis of baby bones in Britain shows nursing mothers were so malnourished that their breast milk lacked essential fats, leading to a condition called kwashiorkor, swollen bellies and stunted growth that would have been unimaginable in pre-crisis times. The disaster's health impacts weren't evenly distributed. Skeletons from wealthy Byzantine estates show fewer signs of deficiency, their bones often littered with fish vertebrae, evidence of privileged access to protein. Meanwhile, in rural Visigothic Spain, researchers found entire families with identical spinal deformities, likely from sharing a single nutrient-poor staple like moldy acorn flour. Gender disparities were stark too. Female skeletons from this period frequently show advanced bone loss, suggesting women sacrificed their own nutrition to feed children first. Perhaps the most insidious legacy was intergenerational. Children who survived the famine bore its scars for life. Their bones, stunted during critical growth years, left them shorter and weaker, a phenomenon called the osteological paradox. Worse, epigenetic research suggests starvation altered gene expression in survivors, potentially passing metabolic disorders to their grandchildren. A 9th century Irish text describes entire villages where the people were small and bent, like shadows of their ancestors, a poetic echo of what science now confirms. These silent testimonies force us to confront an uncomfortable truth. 536 wasn't just a year of death, it was a demographic bottleneck that reshaped human biology across continents. The survivors who rebuilt civilization did so with bodies forever marked by hunger, carrying trauma not just in their stories but in their very DNA. When we study these bones today, we're not just examining ancient suffering, we're seeing the price of planetary catastrophe written in the language of calcium and collagen, a reminder that climate disaster is never just about weather. It's about flesh, blood, and the fragile systems that sustain them. To the people of 536, the darkened sky wasn't merely a veil of ash, it became a screen onto which every terror could be projected. Contemporary accounts mention celestial phenomena that would have been startling even without the backdrop of famine and plague. Comets with tails like smeared charcoal, eclipses that dragged on unnaturally long, and a sun that sometimes appeared haloed by ghostly rings. Byzantine chronicler John of Ephesus described stars that wandered drunkenly across the heavens, possibly referring to bright meteors streaking through the dust-choked atmosphere. These weren't just astronomical events, they were cosmic Rorschach tests interpreted through the lens of sheer desperation. Chinese court astronomers, normally meticulous in their recordings, began noting anomalies with increasing alarm. One report speaks of a broom star, their term for comets that lingered for nearly 3 months, its tail splitting into multiple streaks like cracks in glass. Korean stargazers meanwhile documented a sun dog phenomenon where mock suns appeared on either side of the real one, created by sunlight refracting through ice crystals in the high atmosphere. Normally rare, these optical illusions would have been amplified by the volcanic haze, creating the illusion of celestial armies massing in the sky. The psychological impact of these displays can't be overstated. In Constantinople, Emperor Justinian reportedly collapsed during an eclipse, interpreting it as a sign of divine abandonment. Norse sagas later wove these observations into their apocalyptic myths, the blood-colored moon of 537 becoming the wolf's eye of Ragnarok in later tellings. Even the Maya, halfway across the world, adjusted their long count calendar around this time, possibly in response to Venus appearing dimmer through the ash clouds, disrupting their celestial navigation. What makes these records so chilling is how they reveal the limits of ancient science. Babylonian astronomers who could predict eclipses centuries in advance had no framework for a sky that stayed dark for years. Chinese star catalogues distinguishing between guest stars, nova, and sweeping stars, comets, suddenly included a new category: phantom lights that linger and bleed. The very tools civilizations had developed to make sense of the cosmos were rendered useless, leaving room for raw terror to fill the void. Modern astrophysics offers sobering explanations for what they witnessed. Prolonged comets were likely dust-rich bodies whose tails became hyper-visible against the ash-darkened sky. Those wandering stars, probably fireballs, exceptionally bright meteors made more dramatic by atmospheric scattering. As for the halos and sundogs, ice core studies confirm 536's stratosphere was packed with volcanic sulfur aerosols that would have supercharged optical phenomena. But to farmers watching their children starve, these weren't scientific curiosities, they were the gods themselves unraveling the fabric of reality. The most haunting legacy lies in how these observations fossilized into myth. The Arthurian legend of the pale sun mirrors Byzantine descriptions of the dimmed solar disk. Slavic folklore about the black wind that stole the sky's fire likely originated with ash-laden storms from this period. Even the Bible's Book of Revelation, compiled shortly after these events, contains passages about the sun turning black as sackcloth that read like eyewitness accounts. The sky of 536 didn't just change weather patterns, it rewrote humanity's relationship with the heavens, replacing wonder with a wariness that echoes in our oldest stories. When gold and silver coins vanished from circulation, people didn't just mourn the loss of currency, they reinvented commerce from the ground up. Imagine a Byzantine merchant who once traded Egyptian grain for Syrian olive oil using neatly minted solidi, now bartering with sacks of salt or bundles of firewood. This wasn't mere improvisation, it was an economic revolution born of necessity. Tax records from Antioch reveal that by the 540s, even imperial officials accepted payments in kind, bolts of linen, jars of honey, or days of labor replacing cold, hard cash. The shift was so profound that law codes across Europe suddenly included elaborate tables of equivalence: how many chickens equaled a cow, what quantity of barley could settle a debt. These weren't temporary measures, they became the foundation of medieval economies for centuries to come. The beauty of this reinvention lay in its adaptability. In Gaul, where Roman roads still connected towns but merchants no longer trusted distant mints, local trade hubs sprang up like lifeboats. Archaeologists find these sites littered with tally sticks, notched pieces of wood used to track complex multi-party barter. One discovered near Marseille records a chain of transactions involving a blacksmith's nails, a fisherman's catch, and a widow's woolens, all exchanged without a single coin changing hands. Similar systems emerged in Anglo-Saxon England, where seaters, are tiny silver fragments too small to count as proper currency, became tokens of trust in village markets. The economy hadn't collapsed, it had evolved into something far more intimate and resilient. What's fascinating is how these changes reflected regional needs. Byzantine cities developed crucible systems where goods were assigned values based on gold's theoretical worth, even if no gold existed to back them. Meanwhile, in Scandinavia, the concept of wergild, setting a person's value in cattle or grain for legal compensations, gained new precision. A Frankish law code from this period specifies that a thumb injury required 7 sheep in restitution, while a severed ear demanded 30. These weren't arbitrary numbers. They represented a society recalibrating justice around what truly mattered: survival essentials. The most enduring legacy of this economic shift was the rise of localized craftsmanship. With long-distance trade crippled, villages couldn't rely on imported luxuries. Instead, potters, weavers, and smiths adapted to serve hyper-local needs. Excavations in Brittany show 6th century ceramics becoming cruder but more distinct. Each valley's pottery developed unique fingerprints as artisans used whatever clay was nearby. Textile fragments from the same period reveal a similar pattern. Byzantine silk gave way to homespun wool dyed with local plants, creating regional color palettes that lasted generations. The economy hadn't just gone local, it had become inseparably woven into the landscape itself. Perhaps the most unexpected transformation was in labor value. Roman society had relied heavily on slave markets supplied by conquest, but as wars decreased and famine made feeding captives impractical, slavery mutated into serfdom, a system where workers were tied to land rather than owned outright. A Visigothic contract from 548 records a farmer pledging his labor for 3 years in exchange for seed, grain, and protection, a precursor to feudal agreements. This wasn't just economic pragmatism. It reflected a world where human survival depended on mutual obligation rather than abstract wealth. The echoes of this reinvention reach far beyond antiquity. Modern farmers' markets with their direct barter ethos, local currencies like the Bristol pound, even the blockchain's decentralized trust systems, all carry faint whispers of that desperate yet ingenious pivot. When the coins vanished, people didn't just revert to primitivism. They rebuilt commerce around what could never be devalued: relationships, necessity, and the stubborn human conviction that even in the darkest times, a sack of grain will always be worth more than a vault of forgotten gold. The artistic record from the years following 536 isn't just sparse, it's eerily silent, like a skipped page in history's sketchbook, where 5th century mosaics burst with vibrant scenes of harvest and hunt. 6th century layers in archaeological digs reveal crude scratches on pottery, or worse, nothing at all. In Constantinople, the great mosaic workshops of the imperial palace fell dormant for nearly a generation, their colorful glass tesserae gathering dust while artisans struggled to feed their families. The famed ivory carvers of Alexandria simply vanished from records, their delicate craft too frivolous for a world where bread replaced beauty as the highest currency. This wasn't merely an artistic recession, it was a creative ice age, freezing the cultural heartbeat of entire civilizations. What makes this silence so haunting is how abruptly it cuts across mediums and regions. Byzantine churches that once gleamed with gold leaf icons suddenly made do with simple painted wood. The intricate animal-style metalwork of Germanic tribes gave way to utilitarian iron tools with no decoration. Even in China, where artistic traditions ran deep, tomb murals from this period show startling simplifications, once lively processions reduced to stiff, repetitive figures, as if the trauma had drained the very life from the painter's brush. The Maya stopped erecting their elaborate stelae altogether for nearly 60 years, their calendar system freezing like a broken clock. Archaeologists find this cultural freeze preserved in heartbreaking detail. At a Roman villa in Gaul, excavators uncovered a mosaic workshop abandoned mid-creation, the outlines of an unfinished Dionysus scene still visible in the mortar, surrounded by pots of pigments that dried untouched. In Scandinavia, a master metalsmith's grave contained his tools neatly bundled but showed no apprentice buried beside him, a trade lineage broken by famine. Perhaps most poignant are the Coptic textiles from Egypt. Earlier samples burst with intricate patterns, while those woven after 536 use coarser thread and simpler designs, their weavers likely working with malnourished hands and fading eyesight. This creative drought wasn't just about materials or skill, it represented a fundamental shift in priorities. When Procopius wrote that men forgot the arts altogether, he wasn't exaggerating. Examination of 6th century manuscripts reveals scribes reusing parchment to the point of absurdity. One palimpsest shows 7 layers of scraping, with a classical geometry text overwritten by tax records, then prayers, then finally just a child's shaky alphabet practice. The very concept of art for art's sake nearly vanished, replaced by pure functionality. A Frankish brooch from this period tells the story, where pre-crisis examples featured intricate cloisonné work. This one bears a single stamped cross, the maker's religious devotion outweighing aesthetic pride. Yet within this silence, whispers of resilience persist. In remote Irish monasteries like Skellig Michael, monks kept illumination traditions alive by using fish oil when beeswax ran out, their vibrant colors belying the darkness outside. The Byzantines developed a crude but effective fresco technique using egg tempera mixed with crushed brick, an innovation born of scarcity that would later influence Renaissance painting. Even in the Maya collapse, archaeologists find humble household items, a potter's fingerprint preserved in clay, a child's toy carved from bone, proof that creativity, like life itself, refused to be entirely extinguished. The void speaks louder than any surviving masterpiece ever could. Where other historical gaps leave questions, this absence rings with terrible clarity, a generation that stopped creating not from lack of talent, but because survival left no room for beauty. When art finally re-emerged in the late 6th century, it bore the scars of its long winter. Byzantine icons grew more somber, Norse sagas turned darker, Chinese landscapes acquired a new melancholy. The sky had cleared, but the shadow it cast on human expression would linger for centuries, a silent witness to the year the muses themselves nearly starved. The sky of 536 wasn't just a temporary weather anomaly, it was a historical pivot point that bent the arc of entire civilizations. Imagine living through 18 months of twilight, watching your world unravel season by season, not knowing if the sun would ever regain its strength. This wasn't merely a bad year, it was a trial by fire that forced humanity to either adapt or perish. The volcanic ash eventually settled, the crops regrew, and the plague burned itself out, but nothing returned to what it had been before. The Eastern Roman Empire clung to survival by transforming its bureaucracy into a disaster response machine. Scandinavia's fishermen, having mastered open water survival, laid the groundwork for Viking expansion. Even the humble lentil, once considered famine food, became a staple crop across Eurasia, its drought resistance making it indispensable in the new climate reality. What makes this catastrophe so uniquely instructive is how it reveals civilization's fragile dependencies. The Romans had aqueducts and granaries, the Maya had intricate irrigation systems, yet both found their technological achievements meaningless when the fundamental relationship between earth and sky fractured. Modern climate scientists see eerie parallels in our own time, not from volcanoes, but from the cumulative impact of industrial emissions and ecosystem collapse. Like our 6th century ancestors, we're discovering that no amount of economic or military power can negotiate with atmospheric chemistry. The difference is we have something they lacked: foresight. Ice cores and tree rings have given us 1,500 years warning about what happens when environmental systems tip past their breaking points. The cultural scars left by 536 still throb in our collective consciousness. Every zombie apocalypse story, every dystopian novel about perpetual winter, every folk tale about hungry ghosts, these are the cultural descendants of that ancient trauma. When medieval cartographers drew dragons at the edges of their maps, they weren't just being whimsical, they were encoding generations of inherited fear about a world that could turn hostile without warning. Today, as wildfires paint our own skies orange and hurricanes rewrite coastlines, we're developing new narratives of survival and adaptation, just as the survivors of that dark century did. Yet within this grim legacy lies an unexpected hope. The same event that nearly broke humanity also revealed our astonishing capacity for reinvention. Byzantine engineers redesigned cities to conserve water. Chinese physicians compiled the first systematic treatises on nutritional diseases. Irish monks became unexpected guardians of classical knowledge, their scriptoria preserving texts that might otherwise have been lost forever. Crisis didn't just destroy, it distilled, forcing societies to prioritize what truly mattered. As we confront our own environmental challenges, their example offers a powerful lesson. Survival isn't about returning to normal, but about building something new and more resilient from the fragments. The final irony, 536's greatest gift, might be the perspective it forces upon us. In an age of climate anxiety, remembering that humanity has weathered and transformed after planetary catastrophe before is strangely comforting. Not because it minimizes our current crisis, but because it proves our species has walked this terrifying path before and emerged wiser. When archaeologists uncover 6th century mass graves, they don't just see tragedy, they find evidence of families buried holding hands, of communities sharing their last seeds, of scribes still copying texts by the dim light of guttering lamps. These quiet acts of defiance across 15 centuries remind us that even in the darkest times, the human spirit refuses to be extinguished. As the ash clears from our own environmental reckoning, what will future generations say about how we responded? Will they study our abandoned cities and failed systems, or will they marvel at how we turned crisis into transformation? The choice is still being written not in the stars, but in the daily decisions that determine whether we repeat 536's trauma or finally learn from it. If you've found this journey through history as fascinating as we have, don't forget to like and subscribe for more deep dives into the past's most pivotal moments. And let us know in the comments what other forgotten turning points should we explore next. The conversation about where we've been might just help illuminate where we're going.